There are movies that entertain you, and then there are movies that permanently rewire your brain. Blazing Saddles is the second kind. Released in February 1974, Mel Brooks's Western satire didn't just poke fun at cowboy culture. It grabbed the entire mythology of the American West by the collar, shook it violently, and then set it on fire while a Yiddish-speaking Native American chief watched from horseback. It was outrageous. It was fearless. And even after 50 years of analysis, rewatches, and academic essays, there's still something hiding in plain sight that most audiences completely missed. A blooper so brazen, so perfectly accidental, that it almost feels like the movie planned it all along. But before we get there, you have to understand what kind of film Blazing Saddles actually was, and why it almost never existed at all. Mel Brooks didn't stumble into this movie. He charged at it deliberately. The early 1970s were a deeply strange moment in American history. Watergate had cracked open the federal government like an egg. Vietnam had ended in humiliation. Trust in institutions was scraping the floor, and Hollywood, as it had done for decades, was still churning out westerns where square-jawed white heroes rode into sunset after sunset, while everyone else served as scenery. Brooks looked at that tradition and saw not just a genre ripe for parody, but a mirror that American culture had been avoiding for far too long. The premise of Blazing Saddles is simple on the surface. A corrupt politician, desperate to clear the town of Rockridge so he can run a railroad through it, convinces a bumbling governor to appoint a black sheriff, counting on the townspeople's racism to do the rest of the work for him. What the politician doesn't count on is that Sheriff Bart, played with cool precision by Cleavon Little, is smarter, sharper, and more capable than anyone in that town deserves. The joke was always on the bigots. From the very first frame, Brooks made sure that. One of the key architects of that satirical edge was Richard Pryor, who co-wrote the screenplay alongside Brooks and several other collaborators. Pryor was arguably the most daring comedian in America at the time, a man who used language like a scalpel to cut through the comfortable lies people told themselves about race in this country. His fingerprints are all over the script's sharpest moments, the bluntness, the refusal to soften anything, the willingness to let the ugliness of racism speak for itself so the audience could see exactly how ridiculous it was. Pryor had originally been the top choice to play Sheriff Bart himself. He and the character were built from the same energy, but Warner Brothers refused to insure him due to his well-documented history with substance abuse, including a recent arrest. Without that insurance, he couldn't legally appear on set. So Pryor stayed in the writer's room, and Cleavon Little stepped in front of the camera. Little turned out to be exactly what the film needed, even if it took some people time to see it. Where Pryor might have brought explosive heat to the role, Little brought something rarer in a comedy: genuine stillness. His Bart is unhurried, observant, and perpetually one step ahead. The dryness of his delivery is what makes the racial satire cut so cleanly. When the situation around him is at its most absurd, Little keeps Bart grounded, and that contrast is where the film finds much of its power. Then there was the casting disaster with the Waco Kid. The role was originally handed to Gig Young, an Oscar-winning actor who seemed well-suited to the part of a washed-up, alcoholic gunfighter. What the production didn't fully account for was that Young's alcoholism wasn't a character trait he'd be performing, it was a real and serious condition he was actively struggling with. On his very first day of filming, during the scene where the Waco Kid wakes up in a jail cell, Young collapsed on set. Production stopped. Brooks made the call immediately and brought in Gene Wilder, who had worked with him before on The Producers and who flew out to the set and started filming the very next day. Wilder's performance as the Waco Kid became one of the most beloved parts of the entire film. His sleepy, unhurried energy and perfect comedic timing gave Blazing Saddles an emotional anchor it desperately needed amid all the mayhem. Speaking of mayhem, the campfire scene. It's one of the first things anyone brings up when Blazing Saddles comes up in conversation, and for good reason. No major Hollywood film had ever put flatulence on screen with full audio before 1974. The studio hated it. Executives reportedly called it vulgar, pointless, and beneath the film. Brooks not only kept it, he went back into post-production and added more fart sounds because test audiences were laughing so hard they couldn't hear the end of the gag. He understood something the executives didn't. That scene wasn't just a toilet joke. It was a deliberate dismantling of the romanticized cowboy myth. For generations, Hollywood had sold audiences the idea of the cowboy as a stoic, almost mythological figure, noble, clean, and impossibly dignified. Brooks wanted to show what cowboys actually were: tired, smelly men eating beans in the dirt. The illusion didn't survive contact with reality, and that was very much the point. The film's relationship with chaos ran all the way through production. Brooks actively encouraged his cast to improvise, to experiment, to throw out the script if something funnier was happening in the moment. Madeline Kahn, who played the magnificent Lily von Stupp, improvised several of her best moments, including the iconic breathy rendition of "I'm Tired." Gene Wilder frequently adjusted his lines on the fly. Cleavon Little's facial expressions and quiet sarcasm were largely instinctual rather than scripted. Brooks didn't clean any of that up in the editing room. He kept it all. He believed that the messy, unpredictable quality of genuine human behavior was funnier than any perfectly constructed joke could be. And then there's the ending. By the time Blazing Saddles reaches its final act, it has completely abandoned any pretense of being a normal film. The characters burst through the literal walls of the Warner Brothers studio. They crash into a choreographed musical number happening on an adjacent soundstage. They spill out onto a Hollywood street where the fight continues in front of real buildings and real people. Eventually, Bart and the Waco Kid end up in a movie theater watching Blazing Saddles. It's one of the earliest and most complete uses of self-aware, fourth-wall-destroying comedy in American film history, and it laid groundwork that would echo in everything from Ferris Bueller's Day Off to Deadpool decades later. But here, in the chaos of that final sequence, is where the blooper lives. As the cast pours through the studio gates and out onto the street, caught in the middle of this gloriously absurd, deliberately anarchic finale, a man walks through the shot. He's wearing a sweater. He's not in costume. He is not an extra. He is not an actor. He was simply a pedestrian who happened to be walking past the Warner Brothers lot while cameras were rolling and who strolled directly through the frame with complete and total calm, utterly unaware that he had just wandered into one of the most famous comedy films ever made. The crew noticed. Someone could have called cut. The shot could have been restarted. In most productions, a random civilian walking through a take would mean starting over. But Mel Brooks watched the footage and made a different call. He told his crew to leave it in. The man stayed in the film. He is there in the final cut, walking through cinematic history in a sweater, contributing absolutely nothing to the plot, and somehow making the scene funnier by his presence. Now, one reasonable response to this is to say, well, if Brooks chose to keep it, is it really a blooper? And that's a fair question. But here's the thing. The choice to keep it doesn't change what it was. It was an accident, an uninvited stranger who became part of a film he had no idea he was in. The fact that Brooks recognized its comic value and made the creative decision to preserve it doesn't transform the moment into something that was planned. It makes Brooks a genius editor. It doesn't retroactively make the man in the sweater a cast member. What it does do, and this is the more interesting point, is reveal something essential about how Blazing Saddles was made and why it works the way it does. Brooks had constructed a film where the boundary between controlled filmmaking and genuine chaos was always permeable. The cowboys farting around a campfire looks like it might fall apart. The Yiddish-speaking Native Americans feel like they could have been a late-night decision. The entire final sequence operates on the logic of a film that is actively eating itself. So, when a real stranger wanders into the frame during the most deliberately unreal moment of the movie, he doesn't break the spell. He completes it. He's the final piece of evidence that the world outside the film is just as absurd as the world inside it. Brooks had spent the whole movie arguing that the carefully constructed myths Americans told themselves about the West, about race, about heroism, were just that, myths. Carefully constructed illusions maintained through collective agreement and selective storytelling. And here, in the last minutes of the film, reality itself showed up uninvited and agreed with him. A real person, not performing anything, not trying to be funny, simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time, became the movie's final joke. It's also worth noting what the stranger's presence means in the context of the fourth wall destruction happening around him. The whole point of the finale is to collapse the distance between the audience and the film, to make the viewer aware that they're watching a constructed artifact, a series of choices made by people with cameras. When a non-actor wanders through that frame, it deepens that collapse. He's proof that cameras don't just record fiction. They record everything in front of them indiscriminately, and sometimes the most honest thing in the shot is the person who wasn't supposed to be there. The man in the sweater has never been publicly identified. As far as anyone knows, he has no idea he's in the movie. Somewhere out there, a person went for a walk in the early 1970s near the Warner Brothers lot and came home for dinner without knowing that by the time they sat down, they had become an unwitting footnote in film history. They are, in their own accidental way, as much a part of Blazing Saddles as the beans, the farts, the Yiddish, and the fourth wall that never really stood a chance. Blazing Saddles went on to earn over $100 million at the box office, stunning the executives who had tried to bury it. The studio that had called it career-ending scrambled to expand distribution after the limited release proved impossible to ignore. Brooks, who had final cut authority written into his contract, meaning Warner Brothers legally could not alter the film without his approval, got to watch every one of his decisions vindicated by an audience that was ready, even hungry, for exactly this kind of truth-telling comedy. 50 years later, the film endures not just as a funny movie, but as a document of a particular kind of creative courage. The courage to use laughter as a weapon against the things that actually deserve to be laughed at. The courage to invite chaos in and let it stay. And the courage, or perhaps just the good instincts, to recognize that sometimes the funniest thing in the frame is the thing nobody planned. A blooper preserved. A stranger immortalized. A sweater that belongs to no one and somehow to everyone.